"You people always think you can walk in here and touch cars you'll never afford," Pat Reynolds said, his voice loud enough for everyone in the showroom to hear. "We're not running a charity. These vehicles start at $80,000. Maybe try the used lot down the street. They've got something more your style." The words hit like a slap. A few salesmen laughed under their breath. One customer turned away, pretending not to hear. The man standing in front of Pat didn't say a word. He just looked at him, steady and unshaken. That man was Elijah Washington, a 45-year-old entrepreneur who had quietly bought the very dealership that Pat was managing. But no one knew that yet. Before we continue, tell me where you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that like button, because what happens next will make your blood boil and open your eyes to the cost of bias in America. Elijah didn't flinch at Pat's arrogance. He simply gave a faint smile, the kind that hides a storm underneath. "I'll take a look around," he said calmly. Pat crossed his arms, clearly irritated. "Fine," he muttered, turning to his assistant, Linda Hayes. "Don't waste time on him. He's not buying." Linda hesitated, whispering, "Are you sure?" But Pat waved her off. "Trust me, I know the type." Across the room, Tyrone Brooks, one of the few black salesmen, froze at his desk. He had seen this scene play out too many times. Black customers being brushed aside, spoken down to, and quietly charged more in fees when they finally bought something. He wanted to say something, but he'd learned that speaking up against Pat Reynolds could cost him his job. For Tyrone, silence had become survival. Elijah walked past the shiny cars lined up in perfect symmetry, listening to how the staff greeted others, when a white couple entered moments later. Pat rushed forward, his tone transforming. "Welcome to Elite Motors. Can I get you some coffee?" he said, beaming. But when Elijah asked to see a specific model, Pat's expression hardened again. "Sir," he said, his patience evaporating. "Those models are reserved for qualified buyers. You can't just walk in and test drive a $90,000 vehicle." Elijah smiled faintly. "You don't think I'm qualified?" he asked. Pat smirked. "Let's be honest. You don't look like our usual clients." That sentence hung in the air, heavy and humiliating. Sophia Martinez, another salesperson, looked up from her desk, visibly uncomfortable. She whispered to Greg Thompson, "He shouldn't talk like that." Greg shrugged. "He runs the place. What can you do?" Meanwhile, Angela Davis, a young black attorney in a navy blue suit, was at the finance counter. She was being told that her interest rate was a bit higher than average due to policy. Kevin Lee, the finance officer, assured her it was standard. What she didn't know was that white customers with the same credit score were getting lower rates, and Pat had personally ordered it that way. Elijah overheard fragments of the conversation, his anger growing quietly. He had bought Elite Motors just 2 weeks earlier after internal reports showed consistent bias against minority customers. The numbers were clear. Black customers were being overcharged hundreds, sometimes thousands, in hidden fees and interest. Employees like Tyrone had endured harassment and were denied promotions despite strong sales. But Elijah needed proof, real, undeniable proof. So he came in undercover, dressed like a regular customer, to see how deep the problem ran. Pat watched him from across the room, whispering to Linda again. "He's still here? Must be lost." Linda frowned. "He's polite, though." Pat rolled his eyes. "Polite doesn't pay the bills." Elijah continued his quiet observation, pulling out his phone discreetly, inside his jacket pocket. A small voice recorder was running. Every word Pat said was being captured. Tyrone noticed the subtle move and understood immediately. For the first time in a long time, he felt hope. Pat walked up again, pretending to be helpful. "Listen, I'll save you time," he said. These cars aren't for everyone. Maybe I can recommend something a little more reasonable." Elijah met his gaze. "You're saying I can't afford them?" Pat gave a dismissive laugh. "I'm saying it's good to know your limits. That's all." His arrogance was casual, almost rehearsed. He'd done this before, many times. Tyrone could recall at least 3 customers who'd walked out humiliated. One of them had even filed a complaint that mysteriously disappeared from the records. Elijah's tone stayed calm, but his words carried weight. "I'll remember that," he said. "I'll make sure everyone remembers that." He turned and walked toward the exit. Pat smirked, proud of his dominance. "Have a nice day," he said, voice dripping with sarcasm. When the door closed behind Elijah, Greg chuckled. "Man, you don't hold back." Pat grinned. "You can't teach some people class." Tyrone said nothing, his stomach twisting. That night, when Elijah sat at his desk reviewing the hidden recordings, every insult replayed clearly. "You people always think you can walk in here and touch cars you'll never afford." It wasn't just offensive. It was proof. He saved the audio file, labeling it Day 1. Then he opened his email draft to Marcus Hale, his company attorney. "We're proceeding. Meeting tomorrow. Gather internal documents and prior complaints. Time to clean house. Across town." Tyrone sat at his kitchen table, helping his son with math homework. His wife asked if everything was okay. He nodded, but his mind replayed Elijah's expression, the calm confidence, the measured silence, the way he left without anger. It didn't feel like defeat. It felt like a warning. At the same time, Pat Reynolds finished locking up the dealership. He poured himself a drink in his office, scrolling through sales numbers, proud of how he kept the place in order. He didn't know that his arrogance had just set everything in motion. Linda, on her way out, hesitated at the door. "Pat," she said softly, "you were a bit harsh today." He shrugged. "That's business." She looked at him for a long moment. "No," she said quietly. "That's bias." Pat laughed it off, confident he was untouchable. But the truth was already on its way to the surface. That night, Elijah looked out his window, his mother's words echoing in his mind. "Never let them decide who you are. One day, you'll be the one signing their checks." He thought of Tyrone, of Angela, of every person who'd been disrespected in that place. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow. He'd walk through those same doors again, not as a customer, but as the man who owned everything inside. He turned off the light, whispering to himself, "Let's see how they treat me now." The next morning began like any other at Elite Motors, except for the quiet storm that was already forming behind its glass doors. Pat Reynolds stood at the reception counter with a cup of coffee, bragging to Greg about his instincts from the day before. "You can always tell who's real and who's just pretending," he said, grinning. "That guy yesterday? Hoodie, sneakers, attitude, no way he had money. I saved us time." Greg laughed politely, but there was something uneasy in his eyes. Linda Hayes pretended to check invoices on her computer, but she heard every word across the room. Tyrone Brooks was wiping down a desk, keeping his head low. He had barely slept after what he'd witnessed. He kept thinking about that man in the hoodie, how calm he'd been, how deliberate his silence felt. He couldn't shake the feeling that Elijah Washington wasn't just another customer. Around 10 o'clock, the first few customers began to arrive. A white couple entered, greeted instantly with smiles and offers of espresso. Just behind them, a middle-aged black man walked in wearing a clean polo shirt. Pat's tone shifted instantly. "You looking for something affordable today?" he asked. The man frowned. "I was hoping to see the new Mercedes models." Pat chuckled. "We can check your credit first, just to make sure it's worth your time." The couple nearby exchanged glances, uncomfortable but silent. Tyrone's jaw tightened. He had seen this too many times. At that moment, Elijah stepped through the door again, wearing the same simple outfit, gray hoodie, jeans, calm expression. But this time, he wasn't just observing, he was recording everything, even the way Pat's expression changed when he saw him again. "You again?" Pat said, eyebrows raised. "Didn't I tell you yesterday these cars are way out of your range?" Elijah smiled faintly. "I wanted to take another look," he replied. "Maybe you'll show me around this time." Pat sighed loudly, turning to Linda. "Go ahead and humor him. I've got real clients." Linda hesitated. "Pat, he's just asking to look." "Then look," Pat snapped, waving his hand dismissively. "Just don't waste my time." As Linda walked Elijah toward the display section, she whispered, "I'm sorry about him. He gets like this sometimes." Elijah nodded, his tone calm. "You don't have to apologize for him," he said. "Just remember who's watching." His words carried a strange weight that made Linda pause for a second before continuing the tour. Across the room, Tyrone was helping Angela Davis again. She had returned to finalize her purchase, but the numbers on her invoice still didn't match what she'd been promised. "It's the finance department," Kevin said with a polite smile. "They handle the rates, not me." Tyrone leaned closer. "Don't sign anything yet," he whispered quietly. "Something's not right." Angela looked at him, then nodded slightly. Elijah overheard the exchange and noted it down mentally. When Angela walked to the finance desk, Elijah followed discreetly, pretending to browse. Kevin typed quickly, eyes flicking nervously between screens. "The system adds a few standard fees," he explained. "Nothing unusual?" Elijah glanced at the monitor. He saw two identical loan entries, one with standard interest, one with a $250 premium client rate. The premium version was applied to Angela's file. "What's that extra charge for?" Elijah asked, his voice calm. Kevin looked startled. "Excuse me, sir?" "That fee," Elijah said, pointing to the screen. "It's not listed anywhere else," Kevin stammered. "Oh, that. It's just a protection package. Optional, of course." "She didn't ask for it," Elijah replied. Watching him squirm, Kevin quickly clicked to another page. "We'll adjust that later," he muttered. Pat noticed the exchange and stormed over. "Is there a problem here?" he demanded. "Sir, you can't be standing behind the finance desk. This is for staff only." "I was just asking about the fees," Elijah said evenly. "They seem inconsistent." "You don't work here." Pat snapped. "Mind your own business." The tension was thick enough to cut. Tyrone looked ready to intervene, but Elijah raised a hand slightly, signaling him to stay quiet. "Fair enough," Elijah said. "I'll stay out of the way." He turned and walked off. But inside, his anger simmered. He had seen enough. Enough arrogance, enough exploitation. He stepped into the hallway and called Marcus Hale. "You were right," Elijah said. "The proof is right here. Emails, hidden fees, differential treatment. It's all happening." Marcus's voice came through steady. "Do you have recordings?" "Every second," Elijah said. "I've got enough to file a full FTC complaint if needed." "Then tomorrow," Marcus said, "we make it official." Meanwhile, back inside, Pat was ranting to Greg. "You see that? These people think they can walk in and question my process. I've been doing this for 30 years. They don't understand business." Greg didn't answer. He was staring at Angela, who was quietly leaving without signing her papers. He looked back at Pat. "Maybe it's not business," he said quietly. "Maybe it's wrong." Pat scoffed. "Don't start with that political garbage." But Greg didn't reply. He was starting to realize that silence was no longer safe. Tyrone watched Elijah through the glass wall, noticing the measured confidence in every movement. When Elijah caught his eye, there was a look of understanding, a silent agreement that this wasn't over. Around noon, Pat gathered the staff for a quick meeting. "Listen up," he said, slamming his hand on the counter. "I don't want anyone wasting time on unqualified leads. If someone walks in looking broke, you know the drill. Refer them to financing first. We're not social workers, we're salespeople." Linda looked down. Sophia crossed her arms, clearly disgusted. "That's not fair," she said quietly. "You're making assumptions based on nothing." Pat glared at her. "You don't like it. There's the door." No one moved, but the silence said everything. Elijah, standing nearby pretending to browse, captured the entire speech. His phone recorded every cruel word. When the meeting ended, Tyrone approached him cautiously near the exit. "Sir," he said in a low voice, "you're not just some customer, are you?" Elijah looked at him. "Let's just say I have a personal interest in how this place is run." "You're recording, aren't you?" Tyrone asked. Elijah gave a small nod. "You're tired of this, aren't you?" Tyrone swallowed hard. "Every day. I got 2 kids. Man, I can't lose this job." "You won't," Elijah said quietly. "Not after tomorrow." Tyrone frowned, confused, but Elijah's tone left no room for doubt. That evening, after closing, Elijah sat in his car with his laptop open, syncing the audio files. He replayed the moment Pat said, "If they look broke, don't waste time." The anger in his chest burned, but it wasn't rage, it was resolve. He opened an email draft to Marcus. "Schedule a staff meeting tomorrow. No one leaves until we're done." Then he typed a final note to himself. Pat Reynolds, recorded evidence, day 2, across the city. Pat was laughing over drinks with Greg, bragging again. "You've got to keep order. Greg, that's how you run a dealership. Some people just don't belong behind the wheel of a luxury car." Greg forced a smile, but guilt was beginning to sink in. Later that night, Tyrone sat in his living room, watching his kids play on the floor. He couldn't shake Elijah's words. Not after tomorrow. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, change was coming. And at that very moment, Elijah looked out from his apartment window, phone in hand, rewatching the footage that would soon shake the foundation of everything inside Elite Motors. "Tomorrow," he whispered to himself, "we start the reckoning." By the 3rd day, the calm surface of Elite Motors was beginning to crack. Though most of the staff didn't see it yet, Pat Reynolds strutted into the showroom wearing his usual confidence, tossing his keys on the counter. "Let's make some real sales today," he barked. Unaware that his voice was already being recorded before the clock struck 9, Elijah Washington had arrived early, dressed the same way he had before. Hoodie, jeans, nothing fancy, to the untrained eye. He looked like another man window shopping cars he couldn't afford. But to Elijah, every minute in that building was part of a quiet investigation. He had already reviewed the recordings from the past 2 days. Pat's racial comments, the inflated fees, the false smiles, and sent copies to Marcus Hale, his attorney. Now, he needed one more piece of evidence, proof of intent, inside his pocket. The recorder was running again. Pat's voice cut through the air, loud and proud. "We've got to stay selective," he told his team. "You treat people based on who's actually worth your time. That's how we keep our numbers up." Sophia Martinez shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "What does that mean exactly?" she asked. Pat smirked. "It means you can tell who's serious and who's just looking. Don't waste a test drive on someone who shows up in sneakers." The remark drew a few nervous laughs, but Tyrone Brooks didn't smile. He stared at his notepad, gripping his pen until his knuckles tightened. Greg Thompson glanced at him but stayed quiet. No one wanted to challenge Pat directly. His reputation for retaliation was well known. Elijah watched it all from across the room, pretending to check the specs on a new Mercedes, when Pat noticed him. His expression twisted with annoyance. "You again?" he said loudly. "You really like wasting people's time, don't you?" Elijah looked up. "I just came to ask about financing," he said evenly. "I'm curious how it works here." "You?" Pat scoffed. "Look, we're not a rental company. These cars aren't for test drives. They're for buyers." Elijah gave a small, measured smile. "And how do you decide who's a buyer?" he asked quietly. Pat chuckled. "Experience. You learn to tell who's real and who's not." "And that's based on what? The clothes they wear? The color of their skin?" Pat froze for a second, his confidence flickering. "Watch yourself," he said sharply. "I don't like your tone." "Neither did that woman yesterday," Elijah replied, nodding toward Angela Davis, who had come back again to sort out her loan paperwork. Angela overheard her name and turned toward them. "Is there a problem?" she asked firmly. "No problem," Pat said quickly. "Just helping this gentleman understand how financing works." "It's funny," Angela said, folding her arms. "When I asked about my financing, I got told to take what was offered. Now suddenly, there's time to explain?" Kevin Lee looked nervous behind his desk, typing aimlessly. "Let's not make this bigger than it is," Pat muttered. "You're already making it bigger," Elijah said quietly. "You just don't know how much bigger yet." The tension in the air thickened. Tyrone shifted in his seat, glancing between them. Sophia stood up slowly. "Pat," she said cautiously, "maybe we should." "Stay out of this," Pat snapped. "I run this place. I decide who gets what service." Elijah raised an eyebrow. "Do you?" he asked. Pat turned toward him, eyes narrowing. "Yeah, and I've been running it just fine without interference from—" He stopped himself, realizing he was about to say something that would cross a line even he couldn't defend. But it was too late. Elijah had it all on record. "From who?" Elijah pressed. "Go ahead, finish your sentence." Pat's jaw locked. "I said enough. You need to leave." Elijah smiled. "You sure you want me to?" "Yes," Pat barked, "before I call security." "All right," Elijah said calmly. "Call them, but when you do, make sure to tell them you're calling security on the man who owns this building." The room went still. For a long second, no one breathed. Linda Hayes looked up from her computer, eyes wide. "What did you say?" she whispered. Elijah's voice remained steady. "I said I own Elite Motors. Bought it 3 weeks ago. I've been visiting undercover to see how this place really operates." Pat laughed, a dry, forced sound. "Nice story," he said. "You think anyone's buying that?" Elijah reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, opening an email with the company's official purchase confirmation. The logo of the parent firm, Washington Equity Group, glowed across the screen. "That's my signature at the bottom," Elijah said. "You've been working for me since the day I took over." The silence was deafening. Tyrone's mouth fell open slightly. Sophia stepped back, her hand over her heart. Linda sank into her chair, muttering, "Oh my God." Greg looked like he wanted to disappear. Pat's face turned red, a mix of disbelief and fury. "This is a setup," he hissed. "You can't just—" "Actually," Elijah interrupted, "I can, and I did, and I have hours of recorded proof that this dealership discriminates against customers and staff based on race. You've said enough to bury yourself." Pat took a step forward, his voice shaking. "You're lying." Elijah tilted his head slightly. "Am I? You said yesterday. If they look broke, don't waste time." I have that on tape. You said today that people in sneakers aren't worth a test drive. You've created a system that punishes people who don't look like your idea of success, and you did it under my roof. Pat's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The staff stood frozen, the weight of the truth pressing on everyone. Angela stepped closer, her voice sharp. So it's true then? You overcharged me because of how I look. Kevin tried to speak, but Elijah cut him off. He did, and I have his emails to prove it. He turned to the rest of the team. Every message, every document, every hidden fee, it's all been logged. Pat's composure finally cracked. You don't understand how this business works, he said desperately. You treat everyone the same. You'll go broke. Elijah looked him dead in the eye. If fairness makes us broke, then the system's not worth saving, but you're wrong. It's bias that costs businesses the most. You just never learned that lesson. Tyrone finally spoke up, voice trembling but firm. Everything he's saying, it's true. I've been called lazy. I've been passed over for promotions, and I've been told certain customers belong to me because they're black. We've all seen it. Linda nodded, tears forming. I wanted to speak up, she said softly. But I was afraid. Elijah gave her a reassuring look. You don't have to be afraid anymore. None of you do. He turned back to Pat. You've got one chance to make this right. Tell the truth. Admit what you've done. Pat shook his head violently. You think you can humiliate me? You don't belong here. None of you do. Elijah stared at him, his tone calm but cutting. You just proved why I had to come here myself. He reached into his briefcase and handed Marcus Hale's letter to Linda. Effective immediately. I'm calling a staff meeting tomorrow morning. Everyone stays. No one leaves until we clean this up. Pat lunged forward, grabbing the letter, his face pale. You can't fire me. Elijah smiled faintly. I already did. As he walked out, every pair of eyes in the room followed him. For the first time, Pat Reynolds wasn't the man in charge. The real power had just revealed itself, and the reckoning had only begun. The next morning, tension hung in the air at Elite Motors like static before a storm. The staff gathered in the glass-walled conference room, whispering nervously. No one dared speak too loudly. Everyone had heard what happened the day before. That the man Pat Reynolds had mocked and dismissed was actually their new owner. Elijah Washington. Some didn't believe it. Others were too afraid not to. Pat sat at the head of the table, his face pale but defiant, tapping his pen against the desk as if that small sound could drown out his growing dread. When the door opened and Elijah stepped in, every conversation stopped. He wasn't wearing a hoodie today. He stood in a tailored navy suit, calm, confident, every step measured. Behind him was attorney Marcus Hale, his presence silent but commanding. Good morning, Elijah said, his voice even. Let's get started. Pat forced a laugh. I don't know what kind of game this is, he said loudly, trying to sound in control. But this whole thing is ridiculous. You show up pretending to be a customer and now claim to own the dealership? I've been managing this place for 15 years. I know real owners when I see them. Elijah placed a folder on the table, sliding it toward him. Then you should recognize my name on the deed. Pat's eyes flicked down. There it was, Washington Equity Group, the official signature, the corporate seal. His face tightened, but he didn't admit defeat. Even if this is true, he said, you have no right to humiliate me in front of my staff. Elijah's tone stayed calm, steady as steel. Humiliation happens when truth meets arrogance. Mr. Reynolds, you chose that moment yourself. A faint gasp ran through the room. Tyrone Brooks sat near the back, eyes locked on Elijah, almost unable to believe what he was seeing. Sophia Martinez had tears in her eyes. Linda Hayes sat stiffly, her hands trembling in her lap. Elijah turned to the group. Yesterday, I gave this company a chance to show me its culture, how it treats customers, employees, and anyone who walks through that door. What I found was worse than I expected. He opened the folder, pulling out printed emails and spreadsheets. Here, he continued, are internal memos directing staff to prioritize white clients, emails telling finance officers to add unnecessary fees to high-risk buyers, defined conveniently by race and here. He held up a chart, is proof that black customers were charged an average of $250 more per sale. Every one of you who participated in this system is responsible. Kevin Lee shifted in his chair, his voice barely above a whisper. We were just following orders. Elijah nodded slightly. That's what everyone says, until those orders end up in court. But you'll have a chance to make it right. He turned to Marcus, who stood and read aloud. Effective immediately. All discriminatory sales practices at Elite Motors are suspended. Any employee found complicit in racial bias or fraudulent charges will face review and termination. The words landed heavy. Final. Pat's composure cracked. You can't just walk in here and act like a hero, he snapped. You don't understand how this business works. This isn't about race. It's about money. Elijah's gaze didn't waver. It's always about money, but when profit depends on prejudice, that's not business, that's exploitation. Pat slammed his fist on the table. Don't lecture me. I've built this place from the ground up. You think you can just come in and destroy my work? You destroyed it yourself, Elijah said quietly. The moment you decided some customers were worth less than others. He pressed a button on a small speaker. Pat's own voice filled the room, recorded clearly. If they look broke, don't waste time. Black customers just browse. The silence that followed was suffocating. Pat froze, color draining from his face. That's taken out of context, he stammered. You manipulated it. Elijah tilted his head slightly. There's no context where that statement belongs in any workplace, especially not one you managed under my company's name. Tyrone stood slowly, his voice steady but emotional. It's not out of context. We all heard him say it. He said worse when no one was listening. Sophia nodded, speaking up. He made us ignore certain customers, told us who was worth our time. I stayed quiet because I needed this job. But not anymore. Linda finally spoke, tears in her eyes. He told me not to offer coffee to anyone who looked like they couldn't afford it. I did it because I was scared. I shouldn't have been. Elijah looked around the room, his tone softening. You don't need to be scared anymore. But the only way we fix this is by facing it honestly. No more silence. No more excuses. Marcus handed out new policy documents. Every employee will complete mandatory anti-discrimination training, he said. Finance procedures will be audited weekly. Any violation will be reported directly to corporate compliance. Pat pushed his chair back abruptly. This is insane. You think customers care about all this moral nonsense? They just want the best deal. Elijah looked at him, voice calm but firm. They want respect. Mr. Reynolds, and if you can't give it, you have no place here. He turned to Marcus. Prepare his termination papers. Pat stood up, trembling with fury. You can't fire me. I made this place profitable. You made it toxic, Elijah said. Effective immediately. You're done. Pat looked around for support, but no one spoke. Even Greg, who had once laughed at his jokes, kept his eyes on the floor. The room was united now, but not with him. Elijah extended his hand toward Tyrone. You'll take over as interim sales manager. I've seen your numbers and your integrity. It's time you're treated the way you deserve. Tyrone's eyes widened, voice shaking. Sir, thank you. I don't even know what to say. Say you'll help me build something better. Elijah replied. Because that's what this is about. Tyrone nodded firmly. I will. Pat stared, jaw clenched, humiliation burning through him. You'll regret this, he muttered. Elijah stepped closer, lowering his voice so only Pat could hear. The only thing I regret is that it took this long to stop you. Pat grabbed his briefcase and stormed out, his footsteps echoing down the hall. The glass door closed behind him with a sharp click, and the room exhaled all at once. Elijah looked at his employees, some shaken, some relieved, all silent. This place can recover, he said, but only if we lead with integrity. We're going to rebuild Elite Motors into a dealership people can trust, not one that profits from discrimination, but one that stands for fairness. It won't be easy, but it will be worth it. For the first time in years, Tyrone felt hope in that room. Sophia smiled faintly, wiping her tears. Linda nodded, almost whispering. Maybe now. This can be a place we're proud to work in. Elijah turned off the recorder and gathered his papers. Let's get to work, he said simply. Outside. Pat Reynolds stood in the parking lot, watching through the window as his former team gathered around the man he'd insulted days earlier. For the first time, he understood that power built on prejudice never lasts, and that the empire he thought he ruled had already slipped away. The next day. The atmosphere inside Elite Motors was unlike anything the staff had ever experienced. The old fear that used to hang over them had been replaced by a quiet uncertainty. The glass conference room where Pat Reynolds once held his morning briefings was now the stage for change. Elijah Washington stood at the head of the table, flanked by attorney Marcus Hale and the new interim manager, Tyrone Brooks. Around them sat the remaining staff, some nervous, some hopeful, all waiting to see what would come next. Elijah didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. We're not here to destroy what's been built, he began calmly. We're here to rebuild it, correctly, honestly, and with dignity. What happened here can never happen again. His tone was even, but his eyes carried the weight of a man who had seen too much injustice to tolerate one more inch of it. He reached into his folder and pulled out a series of reports, spreading them across the table. These are the sales records from the last year, he said. They show a pattern of bias that's impossible to ignore. The numbers don't lie. Black and Latino customers were routinely charged higher fees, given fewer financing options, and treated as though they didn't belong. He paused, giving the silence time to sink in. No one looked up. Kevin Lee, the finance officer, swallowed hard, knowing his name was in those files. Sir, Kevin said quietly, Pat made us do it. He said if we didn't hit his numbers, we'd lose our jobs. Elijah nodded. Fear makes people do terrible things. But now, you have a chance to do the right thing. What you do next will define your career, not what you did before. He turned to Marcus. Tell them what comes next. Marcus stood, his voice steady and clear. Starting today, Elite Motors will undergo a complete compliance overhaul. Every sale will be reviewed, every policy rewritten. We've partnered with the Federal Trade Commission to ensure our practices meet federal guidelines. Anyone found deliberately engaging in discrimination will be terminated. Anyone willing to cooperate will have a clean slate under the new leadership. The staff exchanged uneasy glances. They could feel the seriousness in Marcus's tone. This wasn't a warning. It was a reckoning. Elijah continued. But this isn't just about policies. It's about culture. For too long, people like Tyrone were overlooked, while others were promoted for maintaining a system built on bias. That ends today. He turned to Tyrone. You're officially promoted to sales manager. Your results and conduct have earned it. You'll lead our retraining program starting next week. Tyrone's voice trembled slightly. Sir, I don't know what to say. Say you'll make this place better. Elijah replied simply, Because I believe you will. Tyrone nodded, emotion in his voice. I will, sir. I promise. Sophia Martinez leaned forward, her tone cautious but sincere. Mr. Washington, what happens to the rest of us? Are we safe? Elijah looked around the room, his gaze steady. You're safe if you're honest. If you want to be part of the solution, you'll stay. But if you'd rather cling to the old way of doing things, there's the door. His words weren't a threat. They were truth. Kevin spoke again, eyes lowered. I want to make it right. I handled those fees. I knew it was wrong, but I kept doing it. I can't change what I did, but I'll help fix it. Elijah nodded approvingly. That's where change starts, with ownership. Linda Hayes took a deep breath. I should have spoken up sooner, she said softly. Pat told me to deny coffee to anyone who looked like they couldn't afford a car. I did it because I was scared, but I hated myself every time. You're speaking now, Elijah said, and that's what matters. He looked around the room again. No one here is perfect, but silence kept this place broken. Truth will make it whole. The meeting continued for nearly 2 hours as Marcus detailed new compliance systems, legal requirements, and ethical standards. Elijah listened, interjecting occasionally with calm precision. He wasn't lecturing, he was leading. Every word came from lived experience, every instruction from conviction. When the meeting finally ended, he asked everyone to stay for one last moment. I want each of you to look around this room, he said quietly. This isn't just a car dealership. It's a reflection of who we are as people. Every customer who walks in deserves the same respect you'd give your own family. I built my career from nothing because someone once told me I didn't belong in places like this. I refuse to let this company make anyone else feel that way again. The words hung in the air like a vow. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Sophia, who had been holding back tears, whispered, Thank you. Kevin nodded, visibly relieved. Tyrone exhaled deeply, finally feeling seen. Even Linda managed a small smile through watery eyes. Elijah turned to Marcus. Release the memo to corporate. Inform our insurance partners that Elite Motors is now under full reform. And contact the press. We're going public about what happened here. Marcus raised an eyebrow. You sure about that? Elijah nodded. If we hide it. We're no better than the ones who caused it. People deserve to know the truth. Later that afternoon, as news spread through the company, Pat Reynolds' name was officially removed from all company documents. His office was cleared out, his parking spot reassigned. Outside, reporters began gathering near the front doors, curious about the sudden shift. Inside, the staff watched as a new plaque was placed on the wall reading, Elite Motors, rebuilt on integrity, for the first time in years. The atmosphere felt lighter. Customers who entered that day noticed the difference immediately. More smiles, more patience, more respect. Angela Davis returned later that week to finish her purchase. This time, Tyrone handled her paperwork personally. No extra fees, he said, handing her the final contract. What you see is what you get. Angela smiled, signing her name. That's how it should have been all along. When she left, Tyrone looked across the showroom and caught Elijah's eye. The two men exchanged a nod, silent, but full of meaning. That evening, after everyone had gone home, Elijah stood alone in the office, the city lights reflecting faintly off the glass walls. He looked around the quiet showroom, remembering how it all began, with an insult, a lie, and the courage to face it head on. He knew there were lawsuits coming, media headlines to handle, and systems to rebuild. But for the first time, the foundation was right. He turned off the lights, closed his briefcase, and whispered to himself, It's not just about cars. It's about character. As he walked out, the night air felt cleaner, lighter, almost hopeful. Elite Motors had begun its long road toward redemption, and this time, it was led by truth. The fallout came faster than anyone expected. Within 48 hours of Elijah Washington's reforms, the story had gone public, spreading through Chicago's news outlets and social media like wildfire. Headlines read, "Dealership exposed for racial bias. New black owner fires manager after undercover sting." The footage and audio recordings Elijah had turned over to the FTC were undeniable. Reporters played the clips on live television, Pat Reynolds' voice echoing across millions of screens. "If they look broke, don't waste time. Black customers just browse." The backlash was immediate. Protesters gathered outside Elite Motors holding signs that read, "Equal service for all," and "Stop the bias in business." Cars honked in solidarity as people of every color demanded justice. Elijah didn't hide. He stood before cameras in a crisp navy suit, calm and resolute, saying, "This isn't about revenge, it's about accountability. Discrimination has a cost, and it's time businesses start paying it." His words went viral overnight, inside the dealership. The staff watched the coverage in stunned silence. Tyrone Brooks felt something he hadn't in years: pride. Sophia Martinez, who once feared losing her job, was now answering interview requests from major outlets praising her for speaking out. But not everyone was celebrating. Pat Reynolds, meanwhile, was spiraling, fired, humiliated, and now publicly exposed. He sat in his small apartment surrounded by unopened mail and empty bottles, watching his name scroll across the evening news. His phone buzzed non-stop, calls from reporters, lawyers, even former colleagues. But he couldn't bring himself to answer. His arrogance had vanished, replaced by the one thing he'd spent his life running from: guilt. He had lost everything: his job, his reputation, and his sense of control. Within a week, the FTC investigation escalated into a formal lawsuit. The findings were devastating. Elite Motors, under Pat's management, had overcharged hundreds of minority customers. The company agreed to an $8 million settlement, most of it earmarked for restitution. Elijah paid it without hesitation. "This isn't a loss," he told Marcus Hale, his attorney. "It's an investment in justice." Marcus nodded, impressed by Elijah's resolve. "You know, most CEOs would have buried this story." Elijah smiled faintly. "Most CEOs aren't trying to change the system. They're trying to survive it." When the settlement was announced, Pat was ordered to pay a personal fine of $100,000 for his role in directing discriminatory practices. He tried to contest it, claiming he'd been framed. But the recordings destroyed his defense. His own words had become the evidence that buried him. He was banned from managing or owning a dealership for 10 years. The once confident man who strutted across the showroom floor now walked into the courthouse with his head down, avoiding cameras. Outside, protesters shouted his name. Inside, he sat silently as the judge read the verdict. "Your behavior wasn't just unethical," the judge said sternly. "It was systemic prejudice disguised as business. And today, that system ends." When the gavel fell, Pat didn't look up. For Elijah, though, the work was far from over. After the verdict, he called an all-staff meeting to address the next chapter. "We paid the price," he said, "but we're still standing. What matters now is what we do next." He looked around the room, at Tyrone, Sophia, Linda, Kevin, and saw a different kind of company. "This place was broken because people thought silence was safety," Elijah continued. "But silence built the problem. We're done being silent." Tyrone stood and spoke with new confidence. "Sir, the community's watching. They're seeing us make things right. Maybe we can show them what fairness really looks like." Elijah nodded. That's exactly what we'll do. Starting today, Elite Motors will launch the Drive Forward program, discounts for underserved communities, free credit workshops, and partnerships with minority-owned banks. We're going to prove that equality isn't charity, it's smart business. The announcement drew applause, real and heartfelt. Sophia stepped forward. "Mr. Washington," she said, "I've worked in sales for 8 years, and I've never seen a leader stand up like this. You didn't just fix a company, you fixed people." Elijah smiled softly. "I didn't fix anyone. You all did. You chose honesty when it mattered most." Meanwhile, the protests outside began to shift from anger to support. Community leaders praised Elijah's transparency, calling his reforms a model for corporate accountability. Within weeks, customer traffic rebounded. Black and Latino buyers returned, many saying they wanted to support a dealership that stood for something. Sales rose steadily, surpassing projections. Even the FTC issued a public statement commending the company's cooperation. But while Elite Motors was healing, Pat Reynolds was unraveling. His fine had bankrupted him. His friends stopped calling, and his reputation in the auto industry was gone. One afternoon, he sat in a diner on the city's west side, staring into his coffee, when the waitress, a middle-aged black woman, smiled and asked if he wanted cream. He shook his head and muttered, "You don't know who I am, do you?" She frowned. "Should I?" "No," he said quietly. "It's better that way." Later that week, he mailed a letter to Elijah's office. It was handwritten, the words uneven and shaky. "I was wrong. I let my father's voice live through me, his bitterness, his ignorance. You didn't just fire me, Elijah. You exposed me to myself. I don't expect forgiveness." But I needed to say it. When Elijah read the letter, he didn't feel anger. He felt something heavier, pity. He folded it carefully and placed it in his drawer, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of what hate costs. Months passed. The dealership flourished under its new system. Tyrone became a respected manager. Sophia led community outreach, and Linda oversaw customer service training. Kevin, once ashamed of his silence, helped design fair financing policies that would later be adopted by other dealerships. The company's reputation slowly transformed from scandal to success story. Elijah's vision had taken root. Still, he knew reform wasn't a single act. It was a commitment. One evening, Marcus joined him for dinner at a quiet downtown restaurant. "You realize what you've done, right?" Marcus said. "You didn't just save one dealership. You started something bigger." Elijah nodded. "Maybe, but there's still more to do. This isn't just a dealership problem, it's everywhere. Banks, schools, offices. People think racism is about hate, but it's really about systems. You change the system, you change the outcome." Marcus smiled. "Then what's next?" Elijah looked out the window, his reflection calm and steady. "We expand," he said. "We make Elite Motors a model for fairness nationwide. And we make sure no one, black, white, or brown, has to wonder if they'll be treated differently when they walk through a door." Across the city, Pat Reynolds sat in a community center, volunteering to teach job readiness courses. It wasn't redemption, not yet, but it was a start. He told the class, "Your reputation can be rebuilt, but your character has to be earned." Few knew who he used to be, and for once, he didn't mind. Justice had been served, but more importantly, lives had changed. Elijah's fight had cost millions, but what it returned was priceless. A new beginning built on truth, accountability, and the simple power of doing what's right. 6 months later, the story of Elite Motors had become something larger than a local scandal. It had become a national example of redemption. What started as an act of undercover justice had evolved into a movement reshaping how companies across the country thought about fairness. News outlets still mentioned it in headlines. From bias to breakthrough, how one CEO changed the industry, inside the dealership. The atmosphere was unrecognizable. The tension and fear that once filled the showroom had been replaced with energy, respect, and purpose. Customers walked in and were greeted with sincerity. No matter what they looked like or how they dressed, Tyrone Brooks, now permanent sales director, led the floor with confidence. Sophia Martinez managed training programs, helping new recruits understand not just how to sell, but how to serve with integrity. Linda Hayes headed customer relations, ensuring that every buyer left knowing they were valued equally. Even Kevin Lee, the former finance officer once complicit in Pat Reynolds' deceit, had become one of the dealership's strongest advocates for transparency. He had rebuilt his career through accountability and overseeing it all, calm as ever. Was Elijah Washington. He spent most of his days balancing two worlds, the business itself and the reform movement it had inspired. The Drive Forward initiative had grown into a regional program spanning 6 dealerships across Illinois and Indiana, all operating under a new philosophy: equal opportunity, equal treatment, and open accountability. The results were undeniable. Sales had risen by 15%. Customer satisfaction was at a record high, and Elite Motors had regained its reputation not through marketing, but through trust. That morning, Elijah stood before his staff, addressing them in what had become a weekly tradition. "I know it's been a long road," he said, his voice steady. "But look around. This isn't just a business anymore. It's proof that change works when we have the courage to make it. You've all turned something broken into something better." The room filled with quiet pride. Tyrone spoke up. "Sir, my son asked me last night what it means to be a manager. I told him it means doing the right thing, even when nobody's watching. I learned that from you." Elijah smiled, humbled. "Then maybe we both learned something from each other." After the meeting, Elijah walked outside to greet a small crowd gathered by the entrance. Chicago's mayor had arrived to present an award recognizing Elite Motors for excellence in corporate reform and community impact. Cameras flashed as Elijah accepted it, but his smile was modest. "We didn't do this for recognition," he said. "We did it because it was right." The crowd applauded, and someone shouted, "You changed the game, Elijah!" He shook his head gently. "No," he said. "We just played it fair." Later that afternoon, Elijah received a letter from the FTC acknowledging the dealership's full compliance and commending its leadership. Attached was a note from the chairman himself. "Your model is being reviewed as a federal case study for ethical business reform." Elijah leaned back in his chair, realizing how far they'd come. From one act of arrogance to a movement that would reshape policy. But amid the success, he hadn't forgotten the man whose downfall had started it all. A few weeks earlier, he had heard through mutual contacts that Pat Reynolds had started volunteering full-time at a nonprofit helping formerly incarcerated individuals find employment. It wasn't redemption yet, but it was movement. Pat hadn't reached out again since the apology letter, but Elijah hoped he was finding his way towards something better. "Everyone deserves a second chance," Elijah told Marcus Hale when they discussed it. "Just not the same power they once abused." "That's the difference between grace and foolishness," Marcus replied with a small grin. "You've found the balance." As spring settled into summer, Elijah was invited to speak at an industry conference in Washington, D.C. The audience was filled with CEOs, policymakers, and reporters standing at the podium. Elijah didn't use a prepared speech. He spoke from memory, from experience, from the fire that had driven him from the moment Pat Reynolds first told him to check the used lot. "Discrimination isn't just a moral failure," he said to the packed hall. "It's a business failure. Every biased decision limits growth. Every injustice limits trust. We can't build strong economies on weak values. Integrity is not charity. It's good business." The audience rose in applause. And that night, his speech was replayed on national television. Commentators called it one of the most important talks on corporate ethics in years, back in Chicago. Tyrone and Sophia watched from the break room, both smiling. "That's our boss," Sophia said proudly. "That's our story." Months later, Elite Motors was featured in Forbes magazine under the title, "Justice as Strategy: How Ethical Leadership Built a Stronger Business." The article ended with Elijah's quote, "Fairness isn't a cost. It's an investment that never stops paying back." One evening, Elijah visited Englewood, the neighborhood where he grew up, to attend a youth program funded by the New Elite Foundation. He watched local kids learning financial literacy, job readiness, and leadership skills. Tyrone's son was among them, standing tall and smiling for a moment. Elijah felt the circle close, the past and future meeting in one simple truth: real change begins with courage. As he left, the sun was setting over the city skyline, casting a warm light on the dealership sign in the distance. It gleamed against the glass, the new slogan etched proudly beneath it: "Built on integrity." Elijah paused, looking at it one last time, then smiled and whispered to himself, "Justice isn't a moment. It's a way of living." And with that, he walked forward, knowing that what began as a story of bias had become a testament to something far greater: redemption, leadership, and the power of doing what's right, even when no one is watching. Thank you so much for watching this story. If it moved you, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who believes in fairness and justice. Your support helps us keep telling stories that inspire change.